Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our eighth informational webinar. Today, we're talking about knowing your rights when it comes to medical treatment, and this is really for COVID-19 and beyond. Our presenters today are Jan Lampman and Mary Sheehan Bogard. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Jan. As always, sorry, Jan, we do have closed captioning, and if you would like to enable the closed captions, please click on the up arrow to the right of the CC button and click on Show Subtitle. Also, we will take questions or comments in the chat box. If you don't want to ask your question or make your comment aloud, we will be monitoring the chat as well as grabbing comments from Facebook, from our Facebook Live. And so now, Jan, now that we've done all our housekeeping, again, I want to just apologize and thank everyone for joining us today. And we will go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Tedra. Thank you for asking Mary and I to talk about this really important topic. So I want to just give a little context as to sort of how this presentation came about to start with. And that is that when people were first getting really sick with COVID-19 and were entering hospitals, and there was all of the worry about hospitals becoming overburdened, there were some, actually I think they were providers, service providers that were sharing stories about how like at a group home, the whole group home, all the guardians were asked to sign do not resuscitate orders, or providers talking about the struggles they were having with making sure that the person that they supported was getting the kind of medical care that they needed. And there was a lot of talk about, you know, the scarcity and the shortage of medical supplies and medical hospital beds during the beginning of this pandemic. And then some self-advocates pointed out, well, you know, we've always felt like we sometimes get discriminated against when we are trying to get medical care and treatment, right? It's not new. And so this is, as Tedra said, we put together this presentation to help people understand what their rights are, not just during this pandemic and this crisis, but and beyond. Because the rights we're going to talk about are rights that you had before COVID-19 and rights that you have during this pandemic and rights you will continue to have after. I can share with you that the basis for these rights that we're going to talk about might come from a couple of different laws. One of them being a federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then also in Michigan, the Civil Rights Act. And so everything we're talking about is based on already existing laws. However, what we knew is that in the early days of the pandemic, when there was lots of concern, especially, oh, good, Kyle is on the call, so he'll be able to give us an update. Kyle Williams has joined our call, and at one point I'm going to ask him to give us a little update on what he and some other advocates have been doing to make sure that our rights are protected. Because, hi Kyle, because at the beginning of this pandemic, we were seeing evidence that people weren't following the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Michigan Civil Rights Act, and that maybe hospitals didn't understand what their responsibilities were to people with disabilities during the pandemic. And so there were some actions that Kyle and some other advocates took that I think were really important to help us. But if we can, are the slides ready, Tedra, or no? We can talk about what we have a right to, okay? So these are rights that you have, that everybody has. We all have the right to equal access to healthcare, right? That means that we have the right to go to the emergency room or go to a doctor or get a doctor's appointment just like anybody else. Pretty simple. We have the right to equal treatment options as well as people without disabilities. One of the things that we were hearing was happening sometimes is that people who had what they were referring to as pre-existing conditions, right? People who might have some kind of a disability or some kind of health concern were potentially not going to be based on some rationing kinds of criteria, maybe not given the same options as other people. Now that said, before COVID, I can remember times going with folks that I was supporting to doctors, and doctors not understanding that they had an equal right to say, for example, get a colonoscopy if they were over 50. And so it's really important that you know that you have the right to equal treatment options. If I have that option, you have that option. You also have the right to tell doctors how you want to be treated. You know, you have the right to decide if you want to sign a do not resuscitate order or not. There shouldn't be an assumption that somebody else is going to decide for you, right? I think sometimes, especially people who have developmental disabilities, there's this assumption made that they aren't going to be able to be a part of that decision-making process. Okay. You also have the right to have a patient advocate or someone who helped you make decisions to be able to speak to them, and even in this time of COVID, have that person at bedside if you need them. So there was just a decision, maybe you're going to talk about this, Kyle, but there was just a decision that came out of the East Coast, Massachusetts or Connecticut, where there had been a lawsuit filed related to a person who had a communication disability not being able to have their family member at bedside to help communicate for them. And so the court ruled that, yes, you absolutely, just like the Americans with Disabilities Act says, you have the right to have somebody at bedside to help you with communication or decision making if that's what you need. Also, because of some advocacy and a waiver that the state of Michigan wrote to the federal government, you also have the right to have direct care workers with you. So let's say you are somebody who needs help with eating or some other activities of daily living or communication, and you have community living supports. Okay, what happened here? So, and you need community living supports. You have the right to have that direct care worker with you at bedside. And in fact, right now, the way that our waiver has been, tweaked for this COVID-19 crisis, that direct support professional can be paid. You also can have your service dog with you if that's what you need. Okay, next slide. So you have all these rights. You had them before COVID. You have them now. Can we go to the next slide? So one of the things that, with regard to decision-making that we wanted to point out, and Mary's going to talk a whole lot more about this, but it's really important that if you do, well, whether you do or don't, I mean, I've had this conversation with my son. I think it's really important that we all talk to anybody who might be helping us make medical decisions before we need to make those medical decisions, right? So that they know what you would want and need. So for example, you know, people that might be the one that helped you if you are unable to speak for yourself in a hospital, they need to know what your current medical needs are. They need to know what treatments you do or do not want. You know, like for example, when would you want CPR? And is there a situation where you wouldn't want CPR? So having those conversations with the people in your life before you get sick or before you need to have their assistance with healthcare is really, really important. Okay, next slide. We have the, yeah, there we go. So one of the things that we were hearing that was sort of happening, and so we want to make sure you understand, these are some things that hospitals cannot do. They cannot refuse to treat you because you have a disability. That was one of the things that people were somewhat afraid of when there was this whole idea that maybe the hospitals would become overly filled. They are not allowed to place people with disabilities on a lot lower priority for treatment because of their disability. And we know, I mean, I saw somebody in the chat said, maybe made a comment that might say that that's not always been our experience, right? Sometimes people with disabilities are placed on a lower priority for treatment. And that was a fear now during COVID, but it was, I think, a reality even before. I know that I helped a lady one time who was on an organ transplant list. And we had to actually fight for her to even be on the organ transplant list because of the nature of her disability. Was able to get on it, and she did get her kidney. So they cannot discriminate against you for having a disability. and they can't not discriminate against you for any other reason, your race, your gender, your health status, your sexual orientation or identity. So, those are all things that hospitals can't do, whether there's a pandemic or not. So can you go to the next slide? So now this slide is talking about steps to supported decision-making, which Mary's going to talk about. But first I'd like to ask Kyle to come to unmute. Kyle Williams is from Michigan Protection and Advocacy, and I'd like him to share with everyone some of the things that he and others have been working on to make sure that all of these rights I've just talked about are actually being honored in the state of Michigan. So Kyle, do you want to kind of update?
Sure. So Dan asked me to come over and share with you some of the advocacy efforts that we've been doing and that other organizations have been doing with regard to the COVID and addressing some of the issues that became apparent after the COVID pandemic. Probably best to note that a lot of the issues aren't new issues, that COVID really exacerbated a lot of the previous problems with our systems and with our healthcare system in particular. And so some of the efforts that we went through primarily revolved around COVID, but they're not new issues, just to be clear. Probably the majority of our effort has gone into an issue called medical rationing. And so medical rationing is, in plain terms, whenever there's not enough medical resources available for the amount of need for medical resources. And the result of medical rationing is that ultimately healthcare systems are making decisions in who gets care and who does not get care based off of limited resources. And so that's extremely concerning to us, because oftentimes people with disabilities get at the bottom of the priority for medical resource priority. And that's a number of reasons, but we originally reached out to the Legal Affairs Department on behalf of my organization, the ACLU, as well as an attorney and law professor, Sam Bagensauce, to present to them some guiding principles that we would expect the state to implement in any kind of guidance with regard to medical rationing. And all those principles stem from the general assumption that all life has worth, including people with disabilities, and your life is worth saving, essentially. And so we made a couple of specific recommendations on that, but ultimately we're unable to get any movement from the department with regard to our kind of negotiation on that. At the time, we were monitoring the situation nationwide, and following, there's an organization like mine in every single state, and a number of lawsuits were brought within the Office of Civil Rights at the federal level. And we were able to get some movement from the federal OCR, and they ultimately came out with a statement mandating certain principles be applied to medical rationing, which provided us with a little bit better support on our legal basis for what we were arguing. And ultimately what we chose to do is form a pretty broad coalition of disability rights advocacy groups. I'm blanking on the exact number of folks that got involved, but I want to say, including attorneys that practice in the area, as well as groups, as well as individual folks that work in the industry. We had about 15 to 20 folks that signed on to a letter detailing what we felt like the issues were with regard to medical rationing, and asking the state to take some action. And what that letter ended up resulting in was an executive order. It's 2020-64, and that order pertains to folks' rights to healthcare, and that's not specifically limited to folks with disabilities. It's everybody who Jan is talking about with regard to folks in protected classes. But it does have some really specific, strong protections for folks with disabilities in the event that there would be rationing, and just generally speaking, and what your rights are to healthcare in general. So some of the highlights for that is that they had an extremely firm statement that medical treatment will not be based on stereotypes, quality of life assessments, or judgment about an individual's worth. And so those were really key aspects that we wanted to get addressed, because oftentimes a diagnosis or a type of disability carries with it stereotypes to those healthcare providers, that those stereotypes can be used against you negatively. And what the key aspect to making a decision in medical rationing is not what your diagnoses are, or not what your quality of life would be if you were to get out of the hospital, but whether or not you can benefit from treatment, and whether or not you would have what would be determined as kind of a long-term survivability. So that's not to say that somebody who's going to die the next month because they have a terminal cancer diagnosis is going to get treatment over a perfectly healthy 18-year-old. But that cancer diagnosis solely, having that cancer diagnosis is not going to deprioritize you automatically. That they would have an individual assessment based off of your objective medical evidence to make a determination on what your long-term survivability is, rather than just deprioritizing you based off of your diagnosis of your disability. We also got really strong support out of the executive order with regard to healthcare providers providing support for functional needs to the fullest extent possible in the healthcare. So that's a lot of what Jan is talking about with regard to your ability to get your supports in there if you need help with somebody to help you eat or to take care of you, or if you were nonverbal or had trouble recounting your medical history, that you would be able to have that support in the hospital so that you can get better care and be able to maintain kind of your daily needs in addition to whatever else is going on with you that placed you into that hospital setting. So we got really good language and really good protection on that out of the executive order. And then additionally, we got guarantees for ALS interpreters. If that had been an issue with regard to somebody who uses language, they wouldn't have access to a sign language interpreter to speak with their doctor and participate in their care. So we got extremely firm statements with regards to the need to accommodate that in a hospital setting, regardless of COVID or otherwise. And probably the key determination to take out of the executive order is that they made an order that clinical decision-making must be based on the best objective medical evidence that includes an individualized assessment. And so that language takes it away from you have X disability or you have X disability or pre-existing condition, so you are thus deprioritized in getting a ventilator or getting on an oxygen pulsometer or whatever it is that you may need that may be limited. And then it takes it over to that individualized assessment using that medical data that's available in order to make a determination on what your long-term survivability is. So those were really key aspects to addressing potential discrimination in the event of medical rationing, and we got really solid support from our governor on that executive order. After that, we had some outstanding requests from what we were looking to do. So currently, one of the things that we want to do is compile and track data on COVID's effect of people with disabilities. That right now, anybody that's following this issue sees that we have pretty rapidly available information on where the COVID outbreak is happening. Its effect on racial minorities is also very clearly published, as well as the total numbers of death versus cases. And so we want the state to compile and track and report data on COVID's effect on people with disabilities in a similar way that they would do with folks in minority populations that kind of have the effect of this virus on them tracked and have shown disproportionate impact primarily on the African American community, but also in Hispanic and other minority groups. We're seeing a disproportionate impact on that. So that's something that we're continuing to try to work with the state on with regard to that. And we're also trying to get some specific fixes with regard to our ventilator reallocation policy. But ultimately, we have seen the numbers trend downwards. They've continued to trend downwards. And, my anticipation is that, that isn't the pressing need whenever we're seeing our curve flatten in Michigan specifically. But, we're still trying to encourage them to take some actions on that. But, regardless, they know what our concerns are, and these are relatively easy fixes. And so we're hopeful that we can continue to make some more movement on that, as well as some issues that we have with visitor policies and again, the data collection that we're encouraging the state. So in addition to medical rationing, we also addressed very early on the problem of home and community-based services with regard to COVID. That whenever COVID happened, we have moved from, stay away from everybody to use PPE, to continue to stay away from people. But obviously, we're progressing as a society to become more and more integrated with each other with the protections. But very early on in this, there was a tremendous concern that folks that receive services in the community are not going to have those services for them. And ultimately, those services are required for them to stay in the community and stay out of an institutional setting like a nursing home or a group home or a hospital or otherwise. And so we took immediate action to ensure that the state was going to provide guidance and availability and ensure that folks were going to continue to receive those home and community-based services that they required, before COVID and especially afterwards. And so we worked with the department and we're able to issue a number of guidance documents out to prepaid inpatient health plans as well as community mental health and area agencies on aging with regard to telehealth. So not only how you can bill for telehealth services, but how you provide it. A good example that came up on that particular issue is that this released a list of essentially what services you could provide telehealth with and what services you could not. Within the services that you could provide telehealth are ABA services. And so whether you like ABA services or not, the notion that you could provide that over the phone is somewhat complex. So we sought the department and were able to get some guidance on how to provide telecommuting or telehealth services, especially for behavioral health services, and as well as whenever you cannot do that, to set up the procedure in which you can continue to receive those face-to-face services. Because ultimately, somebody that needs help to get out of bed, somebody that needs help cooking a meal, or somebody that needs that hands-on care, you simply can't do it over the telephone. And so we wanted to ensure that those services wouldn't be ceased simply because they needed to be provided with face-to-face. That we felt people were entitled to that, and I believe the state agreed with that, and we were able to get some guidance to support that. Also, we were able to deem community mental health services, behavioral health services as essential, and so that was extremely important because whenever the governor came out with the emergency orders and executive orders, they limited very early on in COVID what services and work could continue, and they limited to what was deemed essential services. And so initially it was broadly defined as healthcare services. However, it was a little bit unclear on whether or not a community mental health or some of the other things outside of long-term care and physical health services were going to be inclusive in that. So very early on in that process, we were able to get some additional guidance out to the PIHPs of the community mental health to establish that those services are essential and thus provide the basis that they would be in compliance with that executive order in order to continue to provide that service, because some CMHs did have a concern with sending people into the home because of COVID, or ability to contract COVID. And a lot of those are understandable. And what we tried to focus on is, preventing folks from being institutionalized and, focusing on what safety measures we could take in order to continue to provide those home and community-based services, under the general notion that the last place that you want to be right now is in a nursing home, is in a hospital, is in an institutional setting where you're going to be congregated in close quarters with other people. This is where we have seen tremendous problems in the state and nationally with regard to the COVID outbreak. So it was really imperative for us, as well as pretty much every disability rights organization in this state, to ensure that we're going to get continued, robust home and community-based services in order to keep those folks in the community where we felt they were the most safe and least at risk for contracting COVID. And we also got some lighter language within the guidance to encourage CMHs to not terminate and reduce services. So, that's pretty straightforward. If you had a medical need for something in the community before COVID, COVID really didn't change anything. If anything, COVID made it worse. So the notion that a CMH or AAA would reduce your services in light of COVID was something that we found extremely problematic. And so we were able to get some guidance out to try and maintain services, although it wasn't, as effective as it could have been, but it certainly provided additional supports on that. So, that's kind of a brief rundown of the two major issues that we were able to deal with and have some success with regard to the outcomes of that advocacy. There's still a lot of things on the horizon to be worked on. I think Jan mentioned hospital visitor policies. We did just have, some pretty big news on that on the 9th of June with the Connecticut Protection and Advocacy, as well as an organization called Center for Public Representation out in New Hampshire, I think is where they are. But they brought an OCR complaint with regard to a hospital visitor policy that was overly restricted for an individual that was nonverbal and had a diagnosis of, I believe it was aphasia, where it just kind of created a problem of recounting medical history and as well as consent to medical treatment. And so that person needed a patient advocate with them and had limited or had that access restricted to them. And so not only did OCR agree that restricted access was inappropriate, but the state actually turned around and issued an executive order specifically on hospital visit policies. So with that added support, we're in a much better position now to try and approach the state on that, outside of having to take individual cases to the department or to court if that were necessary in order to enforce those rights. Because essentially you're asking for an accommodation or a modification from a no visit policy as a result of your disability, that, due to the disability, you would need that patient advocate in order to, recount your medical history or provide consent or otherwise. So, it's a very simple, straightforward legal basis. And we can make some progress on that. Sorry, Jamie, you were going to say.
There's some kind of background sound. I think someone needs to mute themselves.
Mama, look at that.
I hear a child. Okay.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah, so Kyle, that talking about that visitor policy kind of brings us back around to the fact that people have that right to have that person right at bedside if they, for whatever need they might have, whether it's if they need help eating or if they need help hearing what the doctor says and making decisions based on that, right? And
right.
So I think that kind of is a good way to segue into Mary to talk to us about what kind of support we can have when we need support with making decisions, right? Who is that person that could be at bedside? It could be your mom, it could be your sister, it could be, I don't know, a guardian, I suppose. It could be one from your circle, right? So Mary, are you ready to sort of share with us some of the ways that people can get that support?
I am.
Okay.
And so I think what would be best to do here is I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, because I saw a lot of clicks on the chat box. So I'm presuming that people have some questions for you and Kyle. So maybe we could go through and give them an opportunity to answer that, and then I'll move on from there. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment.
Mary, no, there's no questions. People have just been saying good morning, and people have been putting a couple resources in, which will make it into the website. Make it on the website underneath the recording. It'll be the presentation and the executive order. And
okay. I just had the clicks, and I wanted to make sure the questions got answered if there were any.
Hello?
I have a question for Jan. What is your background?
What is my background?
Yes.
Okay, so 35 years ago, I was a direct support professional. And then I became an advocate. I worked for the ARC of Midland for 27 years before I retired to become a consultant. I'm a mom of a son who has autism, who is going to be 20 years old, my gosh, in a couple of weeks. And I've been working, trying to advocate for people's civil rights for my whole adult life.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hello?
before we move on to Mary, are there any other questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I saw someone in the chat box said that they had a client who couldn't get tested because she used a wheelchair. And that's crazy. That, that should not be an impediment. So I wondered if anyone listening had some guidance for that person. I don't know, if they are indeed in Michigan, but some areas mobile testing is set up, and there has got to be a way for this person to get testing. Wheelchair should not be an impediment. Thank you.
Sue?
And I would like to hear from that person.
I'm sorry, my name is Sue from the Calding Community Foundation. And the reason I made that comment, was because they don't have transportation, and transportation was stopped, so there was no way she could get to a testing site. But that was a month ago. You know, and so not everyone has a way. She takes public transportation, but it wasn't available to her to go to a testing site. She doesn't have any relatives that had a wheelchair ramp. She's way too happy to move to transfer to, you know, to the car seat. So I just wanted to put that in there to, you know, just to make you guys aware of that was one thing that we faced. Unfortunately, she did get better. She did telehealth, but she still wanted to go physically.
I'm going to see if Yesenia Murillo is still on the line. And I'm wondering, Yesenia, if any of the new testing sites that are coming up would be, were there any implications for transport? Oh, Angela is saying if the individual has Medicaid, testing for COVID will fall within the eligibility of medical transportation.
That is correct.
So she should have been able to be transported to a testing site in an accessible vehicle, and that would have been covered under Medicaid.
Yes.
Yes, so when we tried to call, they just had the transportation available to her was only one where she had to actually transition into the car. They did not have transportation for a wheelchair lift, and we called 3 different companies.
So your audio is like going, it drops and then it's kind of splitting. And so I don't know if you have a...
We had a lot of storms here yesterday.
Okay.
Sorry.
Maybe the best thing to do here, Kyle and Jan, if you have contact information, maybe this individual could contact you directly following the presentation to be able to get some more information on that.
Can I leave my contact in the chat? Would that be okay? Because I can't hear a word of that. It's not coming in clear for me.
Absolutely. Go ahead and put your info in the chat.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Mary, do you want to continue?
Absolutely. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so one of the reasons we wanted to infuse supported decision-making conversation into this presentation is that medical issues are one of the main reasons why people give for petitioning for guardianship for someone. It's often heard that they're unable to make medical decisions, so they're going to need somebody to make that decision for them. And with supported decision making, there's a lot of tools that can help an individual prepare for medical procedures that they might need and plan for that ahead of time. So again, people can communicate through their voice, through written word, through text, through computer system, through sign language, through high-tech and low-tech communication devices, what their wishes are in terms of their medical support. And so when we think about supported decision-making, we want to start with the 5 steps. The first is just starting that conversation. So I did a presentation with Bonnie last night to family members in West Michigan, and really that's what we did in the first part of the presentation, how to get that conversation started. And we want to give tools, and I'm going to list tools in the chat box as soon as we're finished with the PowerPoint, so you'll have those before you leave the meeting. Different tools that can be used to start that conversation. And then identifying who is willing and able to assist and support you with making medical decisions. So again, you retain the autonomy, you get to make the choice of who you want to help you in that aspect. So one example, I have a family member who needs some support identifying and communicating to medical personnel. So in his life, he chose a person from his church that he's very familiar with, who also happens to be a doctor and on staff at both of the local hospitals. And so this was a great choice for him. It's somebody who knows him well. They're on the same baseball league. They go to the men's group at church together and have developed a relationship and a friendship over the years. So this was a perfect choice for him to make. And then he has a system of backup people that if this person can't be contacted, who are the next people. And he had to have that conversation with this individual and say, do you have the time and are you willing and able to serve in that capacity, to support me in that capacity? This person said yes, so we made sure in his medical record at both hospitals that it's identified who this person is and how the hospital can contact them. The third step is planning and communicating. So again, we had those meetings, we communicated to everyone that's involved in his circle of support, and we communicated that to the hospital. You can set up formal agreements, that's step 4, or you can do this on an informal basis. We don't have a formal written agreement between this doctor and my family member, but you can choose to do that, and I'll talk about some tools that can be used for that later on. Michigan Alliance for Families has some great tools listed on their website. That's one source that we'll make sure we put in the chat box before we end the meeting. And the last part is just letting everybody know. If you're somebody who is supported in more of a congregate setting, you want to make sure everybody at your home, your staff, your home manager knows this information, who you want to help you make medical decisions and have their contact information, the identified person ready. You want to, if you're supported by a CMH or MRS or a disability network, make sure that they have that information as well. Kind of like when you're filling out an emergency contact, you want them to know who you want to be contacted if you have a medical issue. I'm going to switch to the next slide now. So a lot of times we think that this has to be really long and cumbersome and, you know, it has to be done through lawyers, and that's not true. There are a lot of things that are less restrictive than having a guardianship that can help you to identify and kind of formalize who you want to support you in different areas of your life and in the medical area as well. You can sign a release of information a lot of times with the HIPAA law that says that people can't talk about your information unless you want them to. When you sign that release of information, you're letting people know these are the people I want to be involved in my decision-making regarding medical issues. So when signed, an adult with a disability, release of information forms authorize parents and other allies. And other allies could be anybody you choose. It could be a friend, it could be a relative, it could be a neighbor, somebody from a place of worship. So those other allies gives access to the person's records, medical information, and legal proceedings. This helps to ensure quality and continuity of services and care and enhances the supported decision-making process. So again, you as an individual retain the right to choose who you want to be involved, and then you're using a release of information form. That's one of those steps in helping to communicate to people who you want to be involved in that aspect of your life. A next formal step, and there are many steps in between here, could be even a medical power of attorney, and that is a legal document in which you appoint an agent to make healthcare decisions on your behalf when you cannot make them for yourself. An example might be I had surgery a few years ago. I was going to be unconscious for several hours of time. I did a medical durable power of attorney. So
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I'm late.
Durable just meant for a specified period of time, and that was specified as while I was unconscious following the surgery. And I did a durable medical power of attorney to my son, who's 23. And so if there were complications in the surgery, it let people know who I wanted to make decisions on my behalf. Of course, he thought it was great fun. He said as soon as I was unconscious and he had medical power of attorney, he was going to get my hair dyed and all kinds of fun stuff. But fortunately for me, he was just joking. But it can be a very helpful thing. So again, in supported decision-making, there's no one right or wrong way of doing things. It's all person-centered, and it's what makes sense for you. Now, I wanted also to kind of cover my son in that situation by formalizing it. I have multiple siblings who would automatically assume that maybe they were the person I wanted to speak on my behalf. But again, retaining that autonomy in my life, I get to choose who that person is. So
Mary?
medical attorney is another option.
Mary,
Yes,
there's a question.
Okay,
JJ?
I don't box up. If you can read it to me.
It doesn't, there's not a question. JJ is saying that he has a question. JJ, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
I was just wondering, could you like take people off and turn them back, like take people off the thing and then put them back on?
Okay, I could barely hear it. I think you said, could you take people off and then put them back on? Do you mean
Yes.
a medical power of attorney?
No. Like on people's behalf.
Okay. I'm still not real clear on the question. Are you asking, can you choose to have somebody be involved and put them on your list of circle of support? And then maybe
Yeah.
along the way you decide they're making decisions that I'm not comfortable with, so I no longer want them involved? Is that what you're asking?
Yep.
Okay, so yes, that's absolutely possible. Again, in a situation of supported decision-making, you retain the legal right, you retain the authority and the power to decide who you want involved. And we all have relationships in our lives. Some have stayed with us for many, many years, and we've continued with that relationship. And sometimes relationships end. And maybe then you want to identify other people. So again, I would recommend if you change people in your circle of support, then you want to make sure that change gets communicated to everybody as well. Okay, any other questions before I go on?
Yeah, Mary. This is Dennis.
Hi, Dennis.
I'm sorry I'm late. But what if you don't have anybody to make that decision for you? Like, I don't have anybody at this point. I'm single and I don't have anybody to make that decision for me.
Okay. Well, again, I will supply or have Tedra put in the chat box my email information, and we can talk specifically about developing those community supports that may be able to assist you. Sometimes an individual that you can develop a relationship at a local ARC or a disability network that can help you process information and be there and available to assist you. So let's
because
individual email.
Because there's no one left in my family, on my side of the family.
Okay.
Most of my family members had already passed on.
Right.
We already got the burial plan paid for, I think, but I'm not ready to kick the bucket yet. But I'm just saying, I am concerned about that. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, email me and I can help walk you through some tools or put you in touch with some life course ambassadors, because there are some life course tools that you can use to help kind of identify people in your life, whether it's a neighbor or somebody from a place of worship, a friend. So we can talk about that. And sometimes those individuals are from support agencies. It's really up to you to choose who you want to help you make decisions in your life, in that life domain.
Okay.
Okay, so email me and we'll talk more off screen.
Okay, I got it here. It popped up here.
Okay. And then even, the National Guardianship Association and laws I'll talk about, even if a person has a guardian, because we know from statistics, many people in Michigan with intellectual and developmental disabilities already have guardians. So supported decision-making can even be talked about and utilized within a guardianship. So this is from Michigan Compiled Law, Chapter 6. that guardianship shall be utilized only as necessary to promote and protect the well-being of an individual. And here's the part that a lot of people forget, this last paragraph. And shall be designed to encourage the development of maximum self-reliance and autonomy in the individual's life. So even a guardianship is supposed to help that person continue to work toward autonomy and independence and having a self-determined life.
So if I can just interject here for a second, Mary, that goes, this piece of the law right there goes right back to what I said earlier about one of your rights is to be able to hear and be a part of the decision-making, even if you have a guardian.
Absolutely. And the mental health code indicates that even though you might have a guardian, you're still entitled to a centered plan from a community mental health if you're involved with the community mental health. So just because a person has a guardian doesn't mean that you don't have any say in your life.
I think that's very important because I think that a lot of medical decisions could easily, and I've seen, have gotten made without that person's input.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So who to contact if you need help? My email address will be posted in the chat box. Jan, do you want to go over these? And while you're doing that, I'm going to unshare my screen.
Sure. So Michigan Protection and Advocacy is Kyle's organization, and you actually, I think that his email, or what did you put, Kyle? Did you put your phone number in the chat? Kyle put his contact information for Michigan Protection and Advocacy in the chat, but that is an organization, right, that you can go to when you feel like you need assistance making sure that your rights have been honored. Also, if you believe that your civil rights have been violated, you can file a complaint with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and they have an 800 number, and I don't know, maybe we could put that, well, no, this will be in the chat, right? Or this will be somehow available to people with a phone number. Is that correct?
Yes. The recording of the webinar as well as the presentation will be available on the website.
Perfect. Okay.
And
perfect.
all the resources, yes.
Okay, thanks. So also, let's say you just need help with somebody to help advocate with you, or just someone to talk to figure out exactly what your rights are and how to exercise those rights. If you have a Center for Independent Living in your community or a local chapter of the ARC in your community, they are amazing resources. If you don't have a local chapter, both the Disability Network or Center for Independent Living have a state chapter, as does the ARC, of course, has the ARC Michigan. And so those are also places that you can go to get some individual advocacy to assist you should you feel like you're not getting what you need or that your rights are in some way being violated. So.
And I'd like to add to that, it's just so important to speak up. I took a family member to the hospital for a scheduled appointment during COVID-19. And literally when I drove up, somebody came out with a gown, a mask, glove, face shield, and said, okay, I got him, you can go. And I was like, whoa, wait. And literally the family member turned around and looked at me in total panic, like, what do you mean you're not coming with me? And we obviously hadn't talked about that because I was unclear that they didn't think I was going to be staying with them through this process. And so, you know, I had to get out of the car and have a conversation with the person who had to go get 3 different people from the hospital to come out and have that conversation before they said, oh, finally a doctor came out who knew me, who had been present when I was there with my family member before, and said, oh, she can come in. And so, you know, they gloved me, gowned me, masked me, put a face shield on me, and I was able to stay through the whole process to help him communicate what his choices were. So don't be afraid if you get a no initially from a healthcare provider or a hospital to give a little pushback. And I'm sure there's other people on the call, and we'll give you an opportunity to speak in a few moments if you've had any experiences like that. So sometimes you just have to be a strong advocate or have a strong advocate with you. because when he turned around and looked at me, it was with that look that I know means take it away. Like, I don't know what to say to this person. I'm not going in by myself, handle it. And so I could help him to do that in that way. I'm going to share my screen briefly here. I want to show a COVID-19 disability form. It's just one form that can be used. Okay, I'm going to make it a little bigger on my screen here. And it's just one form you can fill out ahead of time if you know you're going to the hospital, that kind of describes things like how you best communicate. So when you think about supported decision-making in medical situations, again, this is just one type of form you can use. You could take this and say, well, this works for me, or I don't like that part, move it around, do whatever you want with it. But we can provide a link to this for you in the chat box, or if you email me, I can send you an electronic copy of this. So again, this is a way to take supported decision-making after you've made the decision, and it's a tool you can use to communicate your choices when you're in a situation. You could ask for this to be on file at your local hospitals, be part of your medical record. All of that are steps that you can take. All right? So go ahead. It sounded like there was a question coming up.
Yeah, I would like a copy of that.
Okay.
From Dennis.
My email's in the chat box. Email me that you want that, and I will get that out to you.
Okay.
Another thing I want to just talk briefly about is, as Kyle mentioned, you know, there's not a lot of statistics on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities specifically, and how many are affected by the pandemic, by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're starting, there's 2 states that have just recently put out some research. We'll put links to this research, articles. I think it's New York, and I think Pennsylvania might be the other one. And what we saw in those first 2 states, where they were actually taking data specific to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, is that they are a much higher percentage than the general population in contracting it, in contracting COVID. And they're also a much higher percentage, if they contract it, in actually getting it more severely and even passing away or dying from it. So when we talk about inequity, I mean, that's another piece that we need to look, inequality, we need to look at that. Like, why is that so much higher? Is it because people with disabilities are more likely to, or have a higher probability of being in a congregate living situation? Is it because they may have other underlying medical conditions? So we'll put a link to those 2 articles, but it's interesting to kind of look at. And then the last thing we would like you to see, I'm going to share my screen here a moment, because there is an opportunity to get involved. Jan, do you have that article, or do you want me to pull it up?
You can go ahead and pull it up, yep.
Okay, so I'm going to pull that up and share that on my screen. So there's some internship and funding. It's going to take me a minute to get to it on my screen, and I just wanted people to be aware of that.
So what Mary's pulling up is as she said, it's an internship opportunity.
So those articles will be posted, the links to those. I have to open up. Okay, so another staff member shared this with me. I'm going to make this as large as I can on my screen. Applications are now open for the second Health Equity Academy in System Transformation Fellowship Program. So we will supply this information in the chat box. So Tedra, if you could take the email here and put it in the chat box. The deadline for these applications is June 26th, so it's fast approaching at noon. But they're looking for leaders from advocacy and nonprofit organizations who are serving communities of color and other marginalized communities, from access to the country participation in 2.5 days of virtual training, and that training will happen in July. So we wanted people just to have this information. So this just recently came out. Brett, another staff from DD Council, had shared it with me. And we wanted you to be aware that this is these internships or fellowships are available. And if you're interested, have the information to apply. All right. So it is right now 12:04. Does anybody have any questions, or do they want to share a situation briefly about trying to access medical care in the COVID pandemic? So I'm going to unshare my screen in the process and ask Tedra to put all these links in the chat box.
She's on it. Tedra's got those in there.
Awesome, Tedra, thank you.
And before we move on, I do just want to share one other resource. The National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems has developed a person-centered healthcare profile. And so while we are on this topic, I'm going to go to it and just share it. And I will also put the link to this. So when you go to the website, you're going to scroll down. There's a couple of webinars that have been recorded that you can access. And then the second thing on here is we have released a person-centered healthcare profile, and you can access the profile template, and it asks you for your personal information, your current symptoms, what medications you take, and then the person-centered part of it. So that's all very medical model. Sorry, I thought my camera was on. The typical questions that you get when you go to the doctor, and then what matters to me. So if you have a name that you go by besides your first name, what do people appreciate about me? Who and what is important to me? How to best support me. So these are just things that if you happen to get in a situation where you are not able to have someone with you right away, you might do some advocacy, or there might be advocacy done on your behalf to make sure a support person is with you. This is just another resource similar to the one that Mary previously shared that has been developed around people with IDD and what they might want. And if you look here at the last section of the first page is, do you have a healthcare advance directive? Do you have a power of attorney? Do you have a DNR, or do not resuscitate order? So it gets really kind of specific, and it's helping you to determine, what you really want for your life and for your care. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I will make sure that I put the link in the put the link in the chat box right now, and I will turn it back over to Mary.
So I think Jan, Kyle, and I wanted to leave opportunity for people to share any experiences they might have had recently in trying to get medical care in the midst of the COVID pandemic, or if you have any additional questions for Jan, Kyle, or I. You can either unmute and ask those or put them in the chat box.
Hi, this is Eileen.
I had, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Dennis. A friend of mine, her father is a quadriplegic, and he had a stroke and had to be taken into the hospital. Initially, she was refused access, and what we did was it was at a Beaumont hospital. We actually, I printed out the guidelines that the hospital actually had, and then she talked with administrators and kind of gave that pushback that you had talked about, Mary, just saying, no, that he needs me as a support person, I need to be there, and then she was allowed in. So that pushback piece is really important.
Right.
So that was just all I wanted to share.
Yeah, unfortunately, the stories I've heard have all involved the person and or their family member or advocate having to push a little.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So please be prepared to push.
Okay.
And you'll even hear things like, well, our legal department, and that just kind of makes me laugh, because I'm like, well, we all as Michigan citizens have a legal department too. So you have to be willing to really speak up and be a strong advocate. Okay, we had another question.
Yeah, well, it happened to me at the hospital. It was about the transportation up to the emergency door. They were told to go in one area, and then bus was told to go in another area. And when I got in there, the receptionist had to get somebody from the back of the building up to the front of the building to get me to go to the back of the building. And that was hard enough because it was unclear where I was supposed to go to get looked at or something.
Yeah. And so that's similar to what could have easily happened with my family member situation. But literally, I mean, that particular hospital has a valet service. So I'm going, I just made it real clear. And it took a few, we kept moving up the chain, so to speak, of people coming out to talk to us before they would, take him in or before he would really go with them. And so they had valet park my car and I was able to stay with him. So again, just advocate for what your needs are and think about what are my needs ahead of time so that you're prepared when those situations arise. Any other questions or people who want to share kind of what their experience has been?
I have a question for you guys. That being said, how far can you push it until they say no? Because sometimes you don't want to push it so far. You know what I mean?
Right. I guess a lot of that is, it's, again, your choice about your life. And it would depend for me if I were making that decision on how critical the procedure was. If I'm dealing with, having heart issues right now, I need to get in there as quickly as possible. And maybe that person who's my advocate, my ally, needs to, push on their own while they're already, I'm already meeting with some medical personnel. In my family member's situation, he was going in for what had been scheduled months before COVID had happened for just some testing, basically. And so it wasn't critical that he had it right at that moment, but it did take some strong advocacy to make it still happen rather than having to reschedule it at a later time.
So at the very beginning, on March 13th, so I think the day before or 2 days before the governor placed everybody at a stay-at-home order, I was at Henry Ford Hospital with a friend who has an intellectual disability and a communication. People can't always understand him when he speaks if they don't know him. And he was having surgery for stage 4 cancer at Henry Ford in Midtown Detroit. And so on March 13th, he had surgery, and they had asked, he had asked, and the doctor had asked that someone stay overnight with him the first night. So we had that plan. That was all planned out. And so I was the person he asked to stay with him. So I was there at the hospital with him. And then on the morning of March 14th, the hospital started sending away visitors, and they started locking down the hospital even before the judge's order. And so someone came into the room and let my friend Izzy know that I was maybe going to have to leave. And so Izzy was prepared. He was fully prepared for me to get arrested rather than not leave the hospital. I don't know that I was prepared to be arrested, but Izzy was very adamant that it was very important that I be there to help him with communication, right? So it didn't take a lot, really, because his surgeon also knew that I needed to be there. And so his surgeon did something magical with the hospital administrators. However, I got to stay. However, I also didn't get to even leave the room for any reason. So I spent 9 days in the hospital with Izzy in his hospital room as the person who was at bedside. So those of you who might be the designated family member, friend, advocate, you want to know that you might be prepared to have to stay there in the hospital with the person the whole entire time without leaving, which is okay.
Okay, here's a question for you then. Are they allowed to tell you that you have to leave since you're advocating for somebody else?
Nope, the person has the legal right to have me there, so they're not allowed. That's one of the things we fought really hard for, and that Kyle had mentioned earlier, that we got clarification from the state, is that nope, they can't tell the person's, the individual that's helping the person with those decisions or helping them at bedside, they can't make them leave. So I wasn't really going to be arrested. Izzy just thought it would be cool. He thought that would be funny.
It's a badge of honor, Jan.
Yes, indeed. He wanted me to have that badge. Luckily, Henry Ford Hospital let me stay, though, so it was all good.
You know you're a true advocate when you've been held in contempt of court or hassled by security at a hospital, you know, you're fighting against a guardianship or, you know, some situation like that. It's a badge of honor.
Indeed.
Okay, any other questions or individuals who want to share information about experiences they've had with hospitals or doctors?
Can I just have a copy of everything that was said and done today? Sent to me through email.
Okay, if you send me an email with the request, I will send you a copy of all the links and the PowerPoint as well.
Okay.
Anyone else? Kyle, Jan, anything you want to say in a wrap up?
I'm very happy that so many people were able to be on the call, and I can't stress enough how important it is for people to know what their rights are and to know that you are entitled to every bit as good of medical care as the rest of the citizenry of the United States. And so, it's important to bring around the circle of people that you know and trust to help make sure that that can happen. We all need to do that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate that, if any questions pop up on this issue or any real, disability related issues, I hope that you'll think of Michigan Protection and Advocacy. We do have information and referral and, kind of short-term assistance that's available for those folks that we aren't able to actually directly represent. And so if you have, questions about what your rights are or otherwise, I hope that you will think of us and feel free to give us a call in order to get that, get that kind of clarification.
I would also like to just add one more thing. The Self-Advocates of Michigan have a Facebook page, and they often post information about various things, including what your rights are. Like, they've posted some really great stuff about your rights for medical care, but also in other areas of your life. So that might just be a really good Facebook page if you're on social media to follow, Self-Advocates of Michigan.
Thank you. That's a good point, Jan. And I will include Self-Advocates of Michigan, a link to their Facebook will be included in the resource section under this recording.
Thanks.
Edra, and then I would just close out by saying, advocate. If you're not sure what to do next, advocate again. Get involved, because unless we all get involved, read those articles that we put links to in the chat box. I mean, it was just so telling as I was reading it. It didn't surprise me, but it saddened me. The percentages and the difference in support that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were receiving. And so get involved in public policy, get involved with an advocacy organization. And, when we work together, that's when change is really going to happen.
There's a question for Kyle.
Okay,
JJ,
now
go ahead.
here's my point of view, and this is what I don't get. When I went to the doctor, you only allowed 3 people. Why is that?
Do you mean as part of the treatment team or as far as visitors are concerned?
Like for the treatment, like people that can speak for you.
So he only allowed 3. I guess I'm missing it. So you would have had 3 people available as patient advocates, and you were limited to 3 folks to be there with you?
No, 3 people that can talk for me while I cannot talk. You get what I'm saying?
I think what he's saying is that he can only have 3 people out there to speak on his behalf.
So as far as the limitation of the amount of people that you could have designated as a patient advocate, is that the concern?
Yeah.
And was there a greater need for more than 3 people as far as availability? Was that the problem, that the 3 folks who were designated weren't available and you wanted to get an additional person in there because of the lack of access to those 3 folks?
I was gonna put my my other family member too, but I couldn't.
Because typically the way, for like a patient advocate designation would work is that you would designate a specific individual who's gonna, be the person who can either guide you or make those decisions for you in the event that you would, lose capacity. And typically you'll see, and this is similar with guardians, that you could have successor identified. And so, I don't know of any limitation that wouldn't allow you to identify, the successor down the line beyond 3. But typically it will set up a priority for who is going to fill in that role as a patient advocate, where you would designate one person. If they're unavailable, then the other person would be designated to fill that role, and then so on. I couldn't tell you of anything that would restrict you from, listing 100 people, but typically what the documents would do would designate the priority for those folks, so that if for whatever reason that patient advocate would be unavailable or unable to fulfill those duties, that patient advocate form would set up for a successor who could come and step in. Ideally, somebody who's familiar with you, familiar with your situation, kind of familiar with, the medical history, ideally, and can kind of assist in supporting and, if necessary, make those decisions under that patient advocate designation. But, typically, you wouldn't have 4 people making a medical decision, because that would require consensus. That it would typically be, you, and if you're unable to do it or need assistance, you could designate a person to do that. Obviously, nothing, prevents you from consulting with as many people as you wanted, just generally or under supported decision or however you wanted to do that, and consulting with folks on, healthcare or financial purchases, or really any kind of decision, being able to consult with those folks. But as far as transferring the authority to make those decisions in the event of capacity, I can see why there may be problems with having 4 people designated to make a determination, because again, what if 2 people wanted to do one thing and 2 people wanted to do the other thing with the 4 folks? Then you would run into, an issue as far as what to do with multiple parties being assigned decision-making authority or otherwise like that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think, wouldn't that be like having a power of attorney instead? Wouldn't that be better?
It's very similar to a power of an attorney. So a patient advocate designation is typically not going to convey, your rights to decision-making to that person. They're often set up to designate a person who can assist you with making decisions. And then in the event that you were to lose capacity, sometimes they do set up for substitute decision-making. Whereas the durable power of an attorney document is typically going to be written up where you agree that in the event of I lose my capacity, this person will step in and either be making financial decisions or medical decisions or whatever you wanted to give up. So in other words, the power of an attorney is going to spring into effect, and it's not going to take effect until you lose your capacity. Whereas that patient advocate form can typically just be, this person is here to assist me and making these decisions. And then sometimes you can include provisions that would, that would spring into effect if you were to lose capacity. So going into a coma or, whatever could happen to you, where you would be able to say, yes, I want this treatment, or no, I don't want this. But the patient advocate form is typically going to designate somebody who you consult with and who, it's, I guess it's more comparable to a supported decision-making situation than a guardianship situation, where you still maintain your right to make those medical decisions, but you have designated somebody to assist you with it.
So I would just want to just say one thing, because I think we're close to wrapping up, and I just want to kind of bring this all back to what I said in the very beginning, which was that we were talking today about people's civil rights. And one of the things that Mary talked about is some of the research where they're finding that people with developmental disabilities, where they're tracking it, are contracting COVID more frequently and getting sicker and even passing away more frequently than people who don't have intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it's very similar, right, to what we're learning about African Americans and their incidence of COVID as well. And those are two populations of people who have not historically, and to this day, don't always have the same access to healthcare and to affordable housing and to other things that create a good quality of life, right, that then can help you be less susceptible to illness. And so we are talking about your civil rights. And so I think Mary's comments, advocate, advocate, then advocate some more, are very important comments. And so we should all just really think about what role can we play in pushing forward past COVID into a world where we don't have to fight for medical care.
Great points, Jan. So I think that's a good note to end on. Again, thank you all for joining us today to get information about this very important topic. Again, my apologies about the mix-up with the Zoom link. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I'm glad we were able to get it handled quickly and still have the webinar today. Next week, we will be talking again about person-centered planning and structuring your day, and what do you need to really be considering as post-COVID. We know that everything's not going back to normal, and so looking at what you need to be asking, what you need to be talking about, and prioritizing what's important to you for your day is going to become really important as stuff is open, but everything's not open, and there's limited hours and limited access and limited capacity. And so we really just want to make sure that people have a chance to really think through what our day is going to look like in the post-COVID world as stuff is starting to open back up. So person-centered planning as a broad umbrella will be our topic again for next week.